So let's go ahead and start the presentation. And I think you're going to find this really, really fascinating. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Right. So what we want to talk about is how this fantastic phenomena that we call crop circles relates to a lot of other interesting topics. We're all living in a very interesting time where a lot of this information is finally coming out from different areas, especially here in the US. We've had a lot of interest in what UFOs, now called UAPs, that I'm sure you've heard about in the news. Basically, military sightings. The pilots have got tired of encountering these objects and not being allowed to talk about it. And these are from events going back 2004 and earlier, are just coming out now. And so it's led to our Congress here, our Senate and our House of Representatives, to push for at least classified hearings about it, potentially. There's a UAP task force that has been ordered to become a permanent part of the Pentagon to report on UFOs. UAP now stands for unidentified aerial phenomena, or some people call it unidentified aerospace phenomena, because it goes in the water and out into space, so it's not always in the air, as you all know, right? But it's led to a lot of interest in these sorts of topics, a whole range of phenomena. I talk to people now, and they have seen the news about these encounters from the Navy, and they're listening. So it leads to us wondering how these are all connected. That's what I want to talk about. We want to talk about what's been called cold fusion, that you may have heard about, low energy nuclear reaction, coherent matter waves, and how I think this relates to what's been called the paranormal phenomena, the balls of light, orbs, and things like this. It seems like it can all connect now. Now, this is my point of view on this. I'm not insisting you have to believe what I'm saying here. This is how I'm putting it all together from someone that's been studying this, as we just said, for about 25 years. So the UAP task force report that came out in June, just to cover it really briefly, did point out that the major barrier to understanding UFOs is sociocultural stigma. It said it right in the front. They said it's not just the lack of data, like blurry photos of UFOs and things like that. They said it's sociocultural stigma that pilots and people in the military and the government are generally afraid to come forward because it can affect your career very easily, especially people from any military, especially in the US. I don't know if it's true over in the EU as much, but pilots are afraid to report what they've seen because they think they'll have to get a psychological exam. Anyway, the UAP report, and this is true of civilian pilots too, not just military pilots. I've talked to many of those also they've all seen stuff up there. But what it means, folks, is that across a wide range of phenomena, whether it's UFOs or crop circles or ghosts and Bigfoot, you don't get as much data as we would want because people feel there's a stigma attached. So maybe we're only getting 5% of the encounters out there of all these phenomena. Maybe we've only heard about a small amount of the crop circles that have appeared on Earth, just because it stays like a local thing. If it happened out here in the US, it could happen in anywhere there's grain crop, Kansas or Nebraska. Maybe people don't even talk about it, beyond their little town. So we don't have a lot of data. We're just working with what we've got, what we've had so far. And hopefully this sort of process we're experiencing now will open it up. Now, I first got really interested, as I mentioned, in the crop circles. I went over on a tour with Ron. The first thing that really captivated me wasn't just their size and their beauty and this kind of amazing weave and structure. It was that people were reporting camera and battery failure. And I saw this immediately in 97 from a distance. We were near the Eastfield Formation in 97. There was a formation there, and then there was up in Westwoods that looked like a hydra type formation. Yeah, that's what it was. There were some. No, that was the year later in '98. There was some. I could see my camera wasn't focusing properly. But in '97, we were with Ron in the Danebury Hill Fort formation. It was kind of a simple three layered formation, kind of three spheres on the side of a circle. And his Sony camcorder melted on the inside as he put it down. He put it down while it was on, not recording, but the button was on. And he sent it back to Sony, and they said that the transformer had melted. And I was always wondering since '97, what could do that? Well, I experienced this myself in Devil's Den. Formation 99, 5 field down, just not very far from Marlborough. And I was there. We walked in. I was there with Masao Maki, a Japanese researcher you might have heard about. He wrote a book in Japanese about crop circles. I noticed first he noticed his camcorder was having trouble, dirty heads indicator on a new camera. I noticed my static meter, which I use to measure static charges. Immediately the battery completely drained. And then Rob Spate came in.
Has just gone wrong, basically. And the screen has gone. Look at this. The screen sort of pixelation. Looks like it's been pushed. This is just solid plastic. The last time I had this, all my batteries got red hot. For the batteries. They're flat as a pancake. Let's have a look. That's certainly same times.
You had 14 hours when you came in.
14 hours of battery life when I came in. Just crap.
Yeah, so this is something that I think some of you probably have experienced or know people experienced. It happened to us in every crop circle tour. After Ron stopped doing them around, I think his last one was 2005. He turned it over to me in 2006. And we've had groups there until recently, obviously because of COVID. And we experienced it many summers, people having cameras stop working. This looked like what you saw with Rob Spate, who I'm still in touch with, by the way. He lives in the U.S. now, in the West Coast. Anyway, this is from Colin Andrews' analysis of the Milton Hill Farms Formation 2000. And he went out with an engineer, this French engineer, I forgot his name. I ran into him at a UFO conference a couple of years ago. It was really nice to meet him. And they took all day to drag a magnetometer, a big industrial grade magnetometer across the field. And they look how the changes in magnetic flux are kind of outlined by the pattern of where the formation is, this kind of Celtic cross around one of these dolmens. So that's just another example where you get these electromagnetic effects around crop circles, right? And I mean, if you're like me, you always kind of wonder, how does an inert subject, inert meaning like wheat, like it's just an insulator, you don't think of it as being wheat, like being electrically active. I mean, not to the extent that it would interact with your electronics. It obviously it's a living plant, but you wouldn't think that, you know, it could have that much energy, but here it seems to do that. We made our own formation in Kansas in 2002. We had permission to make a small one. And the pictures didn't... We were coming back from the IRVA conference in 2002 where Ingo Swann had spoken for the first time, the remote viewer that helped set up the program at Stanford in the 70s. And we can talk all about this, the questions at the end. You know, our pictures came out really strangely. As you can see, look at these pictures, folks. What is going on here? This was taken by Ron Russells. I was with Ron and another fellow, Steve. We were driving back and we made this small formation and then we took some pictures. I mean, what is going on here? This is Ron's expensive professional Nikon camera that never did this before and never did it again. It looks like there's some energy there and the camera's malfunctioning, and some of these are really strange looking. So this is one that we made. So again, I'm asking you to be open-minded here. If you just thought it had energy because the aliens made it, I mean, that would make sense. Believe me, a lot of strange things happen around UFOs, UAPs, whatever you want to call them. I've interviewed these witnesses. Even people get injured from the energy. So it wouldn't be any surprise that you find energy around one if the UFO made it. And we'll look at some of those in a second. Those do exist. But we've made some too. As an experiment, we pay the farmer Mostly, the ones that I've done, we pay the farmer, you contact them ahead of time and everything. Sometimes they've even helped out here in this part of the country. They've come out and helped make it too. So, strange energies. When I was at the Aztec Formation in 2006, the National Geographic Channel wanted to film. They didn't use very much of this, even though it was a great interview, I thought. And they thought so. They showed my hand at the end with the static meter near the credits or something. But they told me a great story is that they knew that they had their cameras affected at Silbury Hill the year before when they went out there. And they knew of the BBC. Maybe you've heard of this case where the BBC came out to Silbury Hill and they had to reboot their Sony Procams from scratch, like totally. They had to call London for instructions. So even film crews have experienced this. I know Steve Wills, who's a UK researcher, I think he's in the Glastonbury area. I've talked with him. He sent me some pictures of this happening with another film crew that he was with. So this is, here's one of our tour guests where it happened after being in the Chutes Formation 2006. Let's see if this...
So, Pam, what happened to your cameras in this article?
Well, you know how when you take a picture with a digital camera, and the picture you've taken shows up in the view screen, and then it goes away, and it shows you what you're looking at so that you can take more pictures. Well, mine doesn't do that when I'm in a crowd circle. It shows me the picture I've taken, and then it shuts down.
And what formations, where did that happen?
I first became really aware of it in the Chutes Formation, and then it happened again in the 8th.
And so the viewfinder, instead of showing you the preview what you just took, it just shuts
Instead
down.
of showing you what you took, what you can take again, it just shuts down. Just the viewfinder, not the entire camera. But it doesn't do that anywhere else.
Amazing. Okay, thanks.
Now, in the Chutes Formation, we also encountered a family coming in when Pam and I were there. She was on my tour with one other person in 2006, I think it was. And these kids coming in, this family, they had seen a ball of light in the woods right beyond the formation. So we did have a ball of light encounter at the same area where she's reporting this. The most extreme this has been with us is a fellow said that when he got back from a formation, we were at East Kennet, he put his key in the hotel door and the key just bent like it had been heated. Very strange, but I'll show you why this makes sense. By the end of the lecture, you should understand why this can happen. This has happened with Colin Andrews, who was with us in one of the tours, I think around 2009. His camera stopped working. Giant's Causeway, that formation south of Marlborough. We've had compasses, electronic compasses stop working. This is a very interesting that in the lower left, a Japanese tourist saw this kind of spiraling helix. I just thought that was interesting that you have this kind of helical luminous object right in the. She saw this with her eyes. And then there was this ball of light that a German tourist took a photo of. He was on his way to visit Koch and Kaiberg on Woodborough Hill. We were there with Koch and Kaiberg, if you remember them. The German researchers, they would make a man-made formation every year as an experiment. They're the ones that kind of created the idea for us to do it too. And their friend took a picture of this before he met up with us. We were right in the trees there. You can see it floating over a formation there in Eastfield. So all of these phenomena, I mean, there's so much to study here, but this is what's always interested me about it. You get the balls of light, you get the camera and battery failure. And how does it all connect? Well, in the previous lecture I gave you in 2015, I won't go over it again too much, but the idea that I was always looking at is there's something about the helicity of the formation, the coherency, what's called an anisotropy in material science is that there's a directionality. Because if you do this, and this is kind of where I was in 2005, if you create a kind of flow, that's the basis for magnetism. It's the basis for how crystals work, kind of to create a vortex. And what do we see in a lot of crop circles? This kind of, I don't know what you call it, a vortex spiral pattern. I was always wondering, since I see this in science magazines, I've been reading science magazines since 1990, since my thesis supervisor just told me to get a subscription because he said there were social science articles in it every week. Well, I found the articles about crystals and vortexes and superconductivity the most interesting. And I started seeing this in 2005. There were references to superconductivity in microscopic scales because of structure and pattern. And I was beginning to think, if you see it at the microscopic, the nanometer level, is there some connection to crop circles where we see it at the macroscopic level? I mean, the saying is as below, so above, as above, so below. It's kind of a fractal idea that there's a continuity. Now, I didn't have a mechanism to explain it, and that's what we're going to look at in a moment. But this is what I was kind of really interested in. It was the type of superconductivity, and what superconductivity is, by the way, folks, is normally the electronics we use, the electricity at our temperatures is kind of inefficient, and the electrons bounce around, and you lose energy to heat. And this is why our laptops and cameras and everything need to be charged all the time, right? Because the batteries wear down because they're not very efficient. Superconductivity is where the electricity flow is so efficient there's no loss. And you can do it at absolute zero temperatures. Very cold temperatures, you can do this and have very low loss of energy in a wire, in any sort of electrical circuit, because the electrons start to become coherent. But the holy grail for condensed material science is, can you do it at room temperature, the temperature we're at? And it is slightly chilly where I'm at, which is why I'm bundled up. It started to get cooler at night. But I started seeing these articles about superconducting systems, and they were talking about this transition zone from normal matter to superconductivity. And I started thinking, are crop circles acting like superconductors? And it sort of stayed there until recently, where we started seeing that a lot of progress had been made in this entire area of science, but ignored. What I'm about to show you is not new. It goes back 100 years, but it hasn't been part of Science magazine or any formal science for the most part. Before we get there, some of the man-made formation, some of the UFO-made formations, I showed you some that we made and stuff, but there are the UFO types too. Let's just get this out of the way. Tully saucer nests in the 60s. People would see flying discs, and when they would leave, the reeds would be in this swirling helical pattern, right? Louise Voves was a woman in the Northwest here who I interviewed for Black Swan Ghosts, and you can watch her video, by the way, blackswanghosts.com. There's no charge. Just go to the website for the book and click the video. She's one of the witnesses. She saw a flying disc in Usk, Washington, near Canada, picking huckleberries with her brother, and the UFO kind of did the falling leaf pattern, kind of floating, and then as it left, it went, she said, made a sound, and flattened the meadow as it left in a line about 30 yards across, flat. I said, how flat, Louise? Flat as a pancake. Does that sound familiar? She saw it. It wasn't a crop circle, but it was a flying object, unidentified, flattening meadows. So UFOs really do this. And the most recent evidence, this is so gratifying. Terry Lovelace, I've interviewed him on my YouTube channel. He was in the Air Force and had this. He was abducted by a triangular UFO in Arkansas with an Air Force buddy. They're medics. They're taking a weekend camping trip. They were just set up their tent. It gets dark, and this triangular thing comes over them. It's all in his book, Devil's Den. Great book, Incident Devil's Den. You can watch the YouTube videos I've done with him. Terry also worked for the U.S. Justice Department. He was sort of a high-level official, so he's worked in the government too. But he wrote a second book about this called The Reckoning, Incident Devil's Den, The Reckoning. He had people who had sent him stories. He put them in this book from around the world. There's a great crop circle story in there from a fellow from South Africa that got invited to his friend's farm. Oh, the friend called him from the farm, said, there's something's going on here, you need to come out. And this guy goes out. There are about 30 of these types of stories in this book, and one of them was a crop circle story. The guy goes out and sees 3 discs hovering over a wheat field, and he goes out there. He actually talks to the occupants, and they offer to have him come in the craft. And he says, no, my friend has a heart condition. He probably wouldn't react well to that. I probably should go back. And they say, fine, no problem. We're just doing science experiments. We'll be gone shortly. The discs take off. Crop circles are left there. Nothing grows for a couple of years. Okay, so there definitely are cases where UFOs, UAPs, are connected to crop circles. No doubt about it. Now, let's see how this all relates back to what we've seen in crop circles. There has been research in this area called cold fusion for going back decades now. And I have learned about it in the last year or two, and it's kind of connected the dots for me. People have attempted to get patents in it, like Mikhail Solin, a Russian inventor. And this is a diagram from his patent application to the US Patent Office. Do those look kind of similar to you? What these are the marks left behind by micro ball lightning at a small scale. Look at the patterns that he's drawn here. They look like circular helical patterns, a lot like some crop circles do. The patent was denied because the US Patent Office said cold fusion isn't real. This is 92 or something. So people have attempted to bring this forward, and we haven't found out about it because the patents have been denied. So this is the Solin patent, and I just thought you'd find this diagram kind of interesting. I mean, interesting little drawings. These are microscopic nanometer scale events. We'll look at them more in a second, but this is what they look like. Fleischmann and Pons, 1989, University of Utah, talk about cold fusion. They believe they've seen excess heat, and in their palladium deuterium solution, heat way beyond any chemical reaction, something at a nuclear level, and the scientific community reacts in a very negative way. It's just a very antagonistic attitude. The scientific community doesn't want to hear it. It's ridiculed. You get all these kind of articles, fusion or illusion. It reminds you of the Wright brothers article in the New York Times, Flyers or Liars. That was what the New York Times said about the Wright brothers. I think they turned out to be flyers. Fusion or illusion, a Science magazine did some articles. MIT, everyone basically made fun of these guys, and they were fired eventually, or they weren't rehired, and they all left the US, and they both passed on now. We did have a presentation from a very well-known Italian scientist who told us, no, it is real. The reason that MIT and the others couldn't produce it is they were using palladium that was too pure. Everyone went out and tried to replicate Fleischmann and Pons with this purest ingredients. Guys, it doesn't work with pure ingredients. As Vittorio Violante from ENEA in Italy told us, it has to be impure palladium. It has to be doped. It doesn't work with pure materials. And the grain size has to be right. And all these things have to be right. He said, no, it's real. It's a resonance reaction. It's a reaction created by resonance that can take weeks to get going. So it's hard to do sometimes. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The other people that tried to reproduce it just simply weren't patient enough. And there was even a presidential commission under Bush that concluded it wasn't real. So that was the end of this research in the U.S. for quite a while, until the research isn't really being done predominantly in the U.S. right now. John O'Meara Bacchus, he wrote this great book called The New Paradigm, and I was reading through it, and he attempted to reproduce Fleischmann and Pons at University of Texas A&M. They got the same results, and excess tritium, which is one of the reactions you get in a cold fusion reaction. Now it's called low energy nuclear reaction. It's not technically like a fusion like the sun the same way, but it's a related process. It's just been renamed a little bit. He got the same results, excess tritium, which you get from adding another neutron to we start with water and you go to deuterium, one of the ingredients, and then you end up with some tritium. Science magazine accused him of planting the tritium. He had to undergo a tribunal at his university. They wanted to first put him on trial for fraud. Then they tried to fire him. He won in the end. All because he got excess tritium, which is exactly what you get in LENR reactions. You get tritium. It's nuclear transmutation. And it really happens. And it's real. But this is how science reacts. Again, going back to the first slide I showed you, stigma related to sightings of UFOs. It's not just UFOs. It's any sort of new information or knowledge. There can be a really serious reaction from your colleagues who feel threatened by your discovery. Hostility. Hello. Bockris, though, survived it, and he wrote the book called The New Paradigm, which was a whole criticism of science, you know, the whole practice of science, modern science, and how it's basically antagonistic to new discoveries. And he went not just cold fusion, but so many new types of discoveries. And we know this, folks, from the history of science. Just talk to Galileo or Giordano Bruno, someone that was actually even put to death by the Inquisition for his ideas. You know, heresy. It's a lot more open than it used to be, but maybe not as much as we would like to believe. I also, by the way, really enjoyed Bockris' book because there, in his chapter on crop circles, he mentioned opening minds. He used me as a reference for the strange electromagnetic effects when he wrote his book. I think it was in 2007 or so. So there was a nice connection back to John O'Meara Bockris, who's no longer with us. But what happened to John was really like a crime against science. I mean, you do an experiment, you get a result. Like we went out and made man-made circles, paid the farmer, and lo and behold, our camera stopped working. It's happened in other formations we've done, the weird effects. It's a result, you know, and so we haven't heard a lot about this whole area of science, but the cold fusion side. Except, guess what? At least in our country here in the US, the military has been interested in it the whole time. So while on the surface you read Science magazine and other magazines, and still to this day they're just making fun of cold fusion, you have really serious military science research organizations within our Department of Defense, and I'm sure in other countries too. I know the Russians are big on this research, Japan, China. They thought it was real the whole time. You can call it condensed matter reactions. And they've been studying it. And look, here they call it LENR, and they say it's a game changer. So it goes from being at Fleischmann and Pond's time in '89, from being some sort of fraud to now it's a game changer, paradigm shifting thing. And they're interested, obviously people have been interested, could you get a good energy source if you're getting this kind of low-level nuclear reaction without any radiation? Could you get energy, like permanent energy out of it? Like, could it be an energy source? And this is what, obviously, why the military would be interested in it. It also seems to be related to, well, I'll show you in a moment, anti-gravity, because of the way that the particles can organize themselves. So we've had a lot of interest in this. There have been patents. Lockheed Martin recently got a patent. This year, they applied in 2011, way back in 2011. You know what they call it now? Coherent matter wave beams. Coherent matter. And let me see if I can, okay. So just so I can show you the abstract, they're talking about systems for creating coherent matter. And this is what this is all about to me. And I'll show you the slides why this all seems to make sense. Whether it's crop circles, whether it's in a cold fusion experiment, whether it's ball lightning, we're talking about matter that is now coherent. In other words, instead of all the particles being at slightly different temperatures and frequencies and kind of doing what they do in our general environment, forming different chemical elements and behaving in the way that nature has designed them, if you use certain technologies to take particles and turn them all into kind of create the same frequency and the same temperature, they become coherent. And they can do things that normal matter doesn't do. Regular matter that is kind of differentiated. And this is what this all comes down to. And it's so interesting that at one level you hear this cold fusion debate and people are persecuted, people lose their jobs. Departments attempt to fire people like Bockris for getting a result that supports something. And yet here we have defense contractors, one of the biggest in the world, trying to get patents in it at the same time. Do you see a little problem here? At the surface level, we're told it's junk science, right? How often have you heard of junk science? How often have you heard that rubric applied to something that you're interested in? Junk science. But you dig a little deeper, the defense companies are patenting it. Hello. So this is what we're talking about here. Systems for creating coherent matter. And in this particular system, they're not talking about putting energy into a system. This is all just done with frequency. Some people refer to it as scalar type energy. It has a principle in physics, the Aharonov-Bohm effect. Very interesting, kind of spooky quantum effect. Even new scientists has talked about this as one of the spookiest effects. You could take a field and totally isolate it off from its environment, and you just send a particle around that field slowly. The particle will adopt the spin, will be influenced by that field, even if you had zero measurement of magnetic or electrical charge by that particle. It picks up the quantum potential of that field, which has been completely isolated from its environment, because it's part of quantum mechanics that there are energetic potentials. And you've probably heard about the Schrodinger wave function, this idea that there's a potential for groups of particles to do many things. Aharonov and Bohm postulated that these effects are real, even from the states of matter that don't technically exist. The wave function potential. And they postulated this, David Bohm, famous physicist, worked with Einstein and everything. He proposed the pilot wave and kind of another way of looking at quantum mechanics. But the evidence wasn't found for about 2 more decades that it was actually real. And this Aharonov-Bohm has now been attempted to be patented by Lockheed Martin. You see this? You're not using energy directly, you're using energy potential. It's really interesting and almost kind of spooky. But you can see it's demonstrated here by Tonomura in 1986. So the Aharonov-Bohm effect is real, and that means you can affect things at a distance without directly using energy, just using sort of frequency and coherence. And so coherence is the name of the game here. And so obviously what I'm attempting to show you is that this has been on the back burner. It's people have been looking at this the whole time, but it's sort of been hidden on the back burner. I guess because it has potential defense significance or something like this. But I think this explains a lot of what we see around crop circles. Let me just show you how. To make matter become coherent, particles, you simply put them, the Lockheed patent puts them in chambers. This is kind of similar, or it's kind of very repeating patterns, what's called metamaterials, right? It's been found in UFO crash materials, this metamaterial, very repeating material at this microscopic subatomic scale. It creates a pattern where all the particles that go through it come out being the same frequency and temperature. You put them in and they're incoherent, right? On one side left, they go out the other side from the cathode to the anode, come out as a coherent matter wave. What is a coherent matter wave? A ball of light. Hello. Now, people have talked about this. Tom Bearden was someone who had been in the American military. He became concerned about Soviet scalar weapons way back in the 80s. And this is from a declassified CIA briefing about the Bohm-Aharonov effect. Can you look right there? And what they noticed is there were weird things that happened around the planet occasionally. Strange things seen in the sky that some people suspected could be Soviet tests of scalar weaponry. Just the same effect. Bohm-Aharonov. They'd been seen, this document, you can find it online now, the Bearden document. And here's one of the interesting symptoms of this cold. It pulls energy. It's not putting energy into the system. It pulls energy out, and all the particles become coherent because you've removed all the excess energy. So the energy is leaving the system, and it's being activated from a distance, and it creates these kind of cold spots. And these cold spots have been observed here and there on the Earth. And some people think it's a type of effect of a coherent matter sort of process or a coherent matter weapon. And this has also been studied by our Air Force here in the US, ball lightning. They've had an interest in it for a long time. Yeah, folks, it's the same stuff that we've seen around crop circles. I once saw, by the way, near Eastfield on Knapp Hill, I did see a little ball of light come out of the ground. And the guy I was with, we both saw it. It was like a blue grapefruit. It was only there for a few seconds. It's a type of coherent matter. There is a variety of ways you can get this coherent matter. It can start from as a kind of atmospheric effect. It can come up from the ground. There's a variety of ways. But the interesting thing is it's been studied the whole time, but it's been classified. So we're all kind of working with the basic SAM research, but when the military gets involved, it ends up having implications for anti-gravity, which obviously would be a very important thing if you could, cancel out gravity or something like that. Obviously, any military would be interested in that, or new types of planes and spacecraft and stuff. So we haven't learned a lot from them, mostly because our documents here are redacted. This is what it looks like when you do a Freedom of Information request, which is something we can do in the U.S. to request information from the government. So we can file a FOIA request, as it's called, and they can say it has national security implications. We're not giving it to you, and they give you the pages, but it's all whited out. Stanton Friedman, the UFO researcher, used to joke about this too when he requested documents. So we haven't learned a lot from the ball lightning, but we know what it is now because it's been studied by so many people in other countries. Coherent matter is, as I showed you before, initially I was sort of looking at just the shape and the spiraling of the crop circles as a type of coherency, right? It's called, what coherent matter is where all the particles are kind of the same. They're monochromatic. They have the same frequency and the same temperature. And what happens is they cease to be single particles and just have a collective property. They cease to be separate atoms like they were before, and they become one atom, one giant atom, because all the separate particles give up their identity and merge together because they're at the same frequency and the same temperature. And you can do this with any type of matter. And we talked about the Ron-Hofbaum effect. Again, it's just using this idea is that if you can kind of create this coherency, you can affect things at a distance, even if you're not having direct contact with them. Just sort of the frequency of it can affect other types of matter. And so what we're talking about is a type of resonance. And this is where it starts to get exciting. And I'm happy to cover this in the question and answers in about half hour or so, if any of this isn't clear. Now, it took me about a year or two to understand all this. But we already see it in two ways, which we'll cover right now. Electronic charge clusters, which have been called exotic vacuum objects, ball lightning, micro ball lightning, itonic clusters, whatever you want to call it. When you have a charge cluster of electrons, for example, and they all get bunched together, they become a micro ball lightning. They become a ball of light. That's what balls of light are from this point of view. You also get them from neutrinos, background radiation from the cosmos, two sources of this resonance which interact in very interesting ways. So the type that we get, and this is just, I think this is just fascinating stuff. You've heard about dark matter, right? You've all heard about this missing matter, dark energy. Well, where does this come from? There is this idea that it's been detected cosmic background radiation from the Big Bang a long time ago, or whatever happened back then, 6 billion years ago. Apparently when our universe was created, there was this huge inflation and a lot of energy being created and particles and so forth. And the background radiation is still out there this day. And it radiates all over the universe. In other words, our universe is filled with energy. It's not a vacuum, it's filled with energy. It's called cosmic background radiation. And astronomers usually look at it like this, kind of, you have this Big Bang and then this period of inflation, right? And you get star formation, eventually dark energy, which is what pushes, this mysterious force that pushes things apart at the biggest scale. So this is sort of an accepted model. And from this inflation period, previous to the inflation, from the Big Bang, you get what's called slow neutrinos permeating the entire universe. Some people call them relic neutrinos, primordial neutrinos. And it creates this distribution of what we call dark matter. And this is just one representation of how dark matter is distributed in our universe. It doesn't distribute evenly. It's gravitational. It has gravity, a slight amount of gravity to each particle, so it clumps together. And this is just one way that NASA has kind of described it graphically. And part of this background radiation are these relic neutrinos. Now, the CERN working group in Switzerland has talked about relic neutrinos. There still is some disagreement what dark matter is. Some people think it's other types of particles, axions and neutralinos. They've invented other particles, WIMPs, weak interacting matter particles, stuff like this. But the simplest way to look at it is that it's just this background, cosmic background radiation neutrino, relic neutrinos, primordial neutrinos. These are not the fast type that you've heard about that come out of stars right now that are at the speed of light and don't interact with your body. Maybe you've heard about these fast neutrinos. They come right through you, and they're passing through like 1 billion through your hand like every second, something like that. And they're so small, they don't even interact with us. Matter. They have detectors set up in Antarctica to look for the fast neutrinos. And they're looking for a flash of light when once in a while, one of these neutrinos would take, like, if it went for 10 years in lead, it would have one collision, something like that. So they're that small, they don't interact with us. These relic neutrinos are different. Slow, they're very slow compared to the fast neutrinos, like 1/50th the speed. And importantly, they have a wavelength that interacts with matter. They're about 5 nanometers, and they interact not just with particles, with entire molecules. They're that big. And the wavelength is that big. So I actually had this idea. Back in 2013, I published this article on ResearchGate, the website, that maybe what crop circles were doing is the reason they had this extra energy. I actually suggested dark energy. This is from 2013. Crop circle and anomalous energy fields and device malfunction. There you go. I now think, okay, I was kind of close, but no cigar. I don't think it's dark energy. Dark energy is the force that pushes galaxies apart. And it's way out there. I put it because it seemed like an energy force, and there are dark energy particles around us. But what I've learned more recently is that dark matter is much more concentrated around us than dark energy. So for that reason, I would just change this investigation into dark matter as the cause of anomalous electromagnetic magnetic activity in crop circles. And that's exactly what I think is going on. Let me just show you a little more exactly how it works. So I got there, in 2013, but it's probably dark matter. So just briefly, people have been seeing this for 100 years. Nicola Tesla, not with the neutrinos directly, but with balls of light. Let's just go there for a second. Tesla experienced transformers burning out. Hello. And he experienced small balls of light in his laboratories. John Hutchison, Canadian inventor, experienced transformers burning out and ball lightning around his experiments, and he was able to melt metal at room temperature, folks. For real. This isn't heated metal. This is the cool thing about coherent matter and balls of light. It's not hot. As I mentioned before, it can even be cool. It can lower the temperature of an area. Isn't that weird? Normally when you think about melting, right? You think heat. This happens at room temperature. It's not hot. You can put your hand near it, you won't get burned. And the Hutchison metal samples, people have given him thick bars of metal, and he's done this to them with his equipment with no excess heat involved. I mean, it's not going up to thousands of degrees like in a smelter. It's just at room temperature. So these are the Hutchison metal fracture samples. When you look at these, it's very interesting because the metals have been transformed to other materials. Look at this, a coin got embedded in one of these. At room temperature, that's what coherent matter can do. It can take things apart and it can put them back together. The metal samples. Winston Bostick was an American researcher at Princeton, I believe. He discovered this in the 50s. he was working to try to find peaceful uses of nuclear energy, perhaps as a propulsion system for space travel. And he created what he called plasmoids. And the newspaper articles said, wow, these are kind of like little miniature galaxies. But we know now that what they are, they're kind of miniature ball lightning, basically. Coherent matter, same idea. And he was able to do it in the 50s. And this was a New York Times article. Physicist creates a universe in a test tube. Now, you look at those little mini galaxies. Do they kind of look a little bit like what we see in crop circles, the pattern, the symmetry? Of course they do, because it's all the same principle at work, in my view. Well, in the sense of the energy processes that are working there, it's created by the coherent shape. And the coherent matter creates coherent shapes. So this was Winston Bostick researched this. He found they often come in pairs. Plasma vortices. Ken Shoulders was researching how John Hutchison did what he did. He worked at SRI, by the way, originally, where remote viewing was invented. The type that I do and still teach to this day. I have another class coming up in November. But what I learned how to do. He worked at the same institute, but he was working with sort of different subjects. And he called these things exotic vacuum objects. Charge clusters. It was just his name for them because they kind of exist in their own vacuum space and they have a lot of energy. And he said that these things, you're creating them all the time. They're omnipresent. Every time you walk across a rug, you get a static shock from the doorknob, you create little EVOs. They don't persist. In these experiments, cold fusion, you're getting them to persist, so they're doing something. But we're around them all the time. Every time you see water running down a stream, you're creating a little bit of cavitation. The water's hitting the rocks and things. That creates little exotic vacuum objects. So our universe is really filled with these. And again, it's all sort of, these are all sort of connected, and we've had the research on the classified side, and we've had researchers publicly doing this to show that coherent matter can create very interesting exotic effects that are just, things that people say they really want, sort of sustainable energy, propulsion systems that don't pollute, gravity cancellation, things like this. Even the Navy has submitted their own patents recently using, zirconium, lead, and PZT to create sustainable energy systems, which is the same thing. They've got a pulse source there and coils, and it's the same thing that Ken Shoulders and Tesla and everyone else is working with. So it's kind of like the idea of a laser, where you have the kind of a beam of light that's very coherent. But this would be called more like a baser. You'd call it a baser. Why? Because it's like material that comes together in physics. It's called a boson. So it's coherent bosons. You can call it a baser. And ball lightning has been seen, you're probably all heard of this. It's been considered really mysterious for a while just because it spontaneously forms. The reason it seems to come down chimneys, by the way, and a lot of this material is, I'm getting this from the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project and Bob Greenyer, who have a great YouTube channel. Bob's presenting on this recently, sometimes twice a week. So I've learned a lot. A lot of this is, I've learned it from them, kind of these final ideas here. Ball lightning is attracted to carbon, which you find a lot on chimneys, which is why it comes down into people's homes. It's been seen for hundreds of years. For the most part, it can just go through things, and it leaves metal like in a jelly-like state. There was a case in Russia where ball lightning came through the side of a train window, and the person was able to mold the aluminum in their hands, but it wasn't hot. But it was still, in a kind of a liquid form. Isn't that weird? There are times where ball lightning does, though, injure people and destroy electronics too. Because when the energy form collapses, a lot of energy comes out of it. It goes from coherent to incoherent. This is why it would be attracted to our electronics in crop circles. Even if you haven't seen it, you can get these EVOs accumulating from a variety of forms. And a lot of people have studied ball lightning. You probably haven't heard of many of these people, but people have been doing it since the 1800s. So whether you want to call it micro ball lightning, itonic clusters, exotic vacuum objects, at the smallest scale, we call it cold fusion, low energy nuclear reaction, when it's visible in the air around a lightning storm. And some people even think that ball lightning is the source of lightning, which is an interesting idea. You know, for a while it's been thought that ball lightning comes out of a lightning storm. Some people think that it's the coherent ball that starts the whole process to begin with. But whatever you want to call it, we're talking about charge cluster bunching. You put the electrons together, you get them really close, or it can even be these neutrinos, these relic neutrinos, and they form this cluster. The researcher in Japan, Takeaki Matsumoto, studied this all through the 90s, and all of his research is all consistent with this. He called it itonic clusters. But it's just all the same name for different names for the same thing. They're persistent, they can tunnel, leave really strange tracks in materials. Very interesting is they can cause nuclear transmutation. Now, all of us in high school were told that alchemy isn't real, right? If you're like me, you know, like you heard about Isaac Newton, and he's famous for discovering his laws of physics and motion, conservation of motion. But he also was an alchemist, right? And that was the crazy side of Newton that, you know, we're not told about, but we're just told about the other side. Well, EVOs, no doubt about it, when they tunnel through materials, transmute the materials into different elements. They spew out all the elements of life, you know, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and silicon, magnesium, all the things that are essential for living things. Maybe these are what created life on Earth to begin with, is the EVOs just generated all these elements from a few that we started with, from hydrogen. You'd end up with all these elements. So alchemy turns out to be real. And here's the real cool thing about it. It can transmute radioactive materials into non-radioactive materials in a short amount of time. It can turn radioactive materials into carbon and other harmless materials. So the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project is suggesting using this to work with the tritium wastewater at Fukushima in Japan. And so maybe that'll be another use of it. Anyway, you get these coherent looking crystals out of this. The EVOs look like this when they've been photographed. They look like little birdies or mushrooms. Isn't it interesting? They are temporary they're magnets with only one pole, which is something that Paul Dirac suggested back in, I think, the 30s. This entire area is sort of vindication of what Paul Dirac said. He said there should be these antiparticles, and it comes out of his reading of quantum mechanics that there should be these magnetic monopoles and these other particles that people couldn't find for a long time. So this kind of goes back to some of the early quantum physicists. Coherent matter. You know, they have these shapes, and they kind of don't physically move, but they move energetically, so to speak. And because of the energy, when they tunnel through a substance, they kind of leave a vortical helical pattern. They can leave these beautiful crystals behind from a low energy nuclear reaction. And I mean, look at these little patterns you see in there. They're micro tornadoes is what they're called. And the top left and right, you can see what they look like under an electron microscope. It's a little ball. You can see the blue arrow I have there on the left. And it kind of tunnels through and kind of does this corkscrew pattern of energy, a little micro ball lightning. When they impact a substance, they can either sustain themselves for a long period of time. In other words, they can stay in metals for a lot longer, even after an experiment is shut off. I think the Russians have found them 2 months, active 2 months after their experiments, and other people have even gone longer than that. Isn't that incredible? So these little EVOs, they're like these little bad boys that you turn off your experiment and they're still active doing their whatever they do, shorting out their electronics or whatever they're doing, and they leave these little impact marks. If they kind of blow up when they hit the side of something, they leave these little impact marks on the side. These little Evo impact strike marks. And they create these little tornado-like shapes you can see in the upper right in the altar, one of the other experiments that people have. This has all been done by volunteers. And this is so cool. You know, all of us in the crop circle area, we spend a lot of time and money going out to see the crop circles. It's kind of like citizen science, right? We've just kind of taken it on ourselves to investigate this. Other people have done this with cold fusion, LENR. And it's all come together. It's all the same. It all makes sense. And it's been done by volunteers. Here's the Vega experiments, so-called. It's another project associated with the MFMP. Now there's the ball lightning, but look what's coming out of the ball lightning. It's these little corkscrew-like patterns of clusters of neutrinos coming out of the ball lightning. Relic neutrinos, the type I told you about from the Big Bang, that are all around us, which some people have called chi energy. I've studied Taoist practices for a long time. I took Tai Chi, and I've had different Qigong instructors, Mantak Chi, and others over the years. Talked about chi energy. You've heard about this, right? It's real. It is really there. It's this background radiation. It has all these effects. And sometimes it can cluster together and come out. It interacts with charge clusters. And so you see these little neutrino clusters coming out of the ball lightning. Isn't that cool? And this is kind of what ball lightning kind of looks like as a structure. You have kind of rings within rings of it. It's kind of fractal. Another person that discovered the same thing, I think we're seeing a pattern here, John Wheeler, the thesis supervisor for Hugh Everett, who I studied with the multiverse ideas that I've presented at different conferences over the years, the idea that we live around parallel realities, something we can talk about another time. John Wheeler, who was the supervisor of Hugh Everett, who didn't really go along with those ideas, by the way, about parallel realities at the time. He was more of a traditionalist, a Copenhagen guy. But he did come up with this charge clusters. He called them geons. But it's the same thing as coherent particles, and he said it would create its own gravitational field. Hello, gravitational field from electron clusters. This is why you see ball lightning move against the wind. It doesn't seem affected by what it's around, right? Let's check the time here. Okay, little ball lightnings. So anyway, when the ball lightning, these micro ball lightnings, EVOs, whatever you want to call them, when they track through a material, they leave these kind of strange fractal looking tracks. It's just kind of cool. Now, the reason these photos are interesting, again, from Bob Greenyer, very thanks to Bob for putting all this together. He's done so much work to kind of connect all the dots here. It's just incredible. All these different experiments over the years, look, you get the same tracks. Ken Shoulders, some of the MFMP research projects. I'm told, folks, you can create your own mini ball lightning with a cavitator that you can buy from Amazon for $30. Water cavitator. You create the little cavitating water, it creates these little mini EVOs. If you had a scanning electron microscope, you could see the transmutation yourself from your own $30 experiment with water. But look at all these different experiments over the years. Same tracks, whether it's from Ken Shoulders or anyone else's experiment. Mark Leclerc did this. Now, there is a word of caution here. If you get the EVOs, if you overdrive them too hard, they can start creating heavy elements. They start by creating the lighter elements like carbon and silicon and magnesium, calcium. If you keep driving the process, they will keep transmuting and transmuting. When you get past lead, you're starting to get to radioactive materials. Mark Leclerc did get a radiation poisoning. I met Mark at one of these energy conferences. It was called the Breakthrough Energy Movement, the BEM conferences. They had one in Boulder, and I saw Mark. He was talking about cavitation. It's fascinating. You know, the bubbles, and they collapse. It's really fast, and they create a lot of energy. He created a company called Nanospire. Anyway, you get a lot of elements in the periodic table. You can get radioactive elements too far and get some poison. So you don't want to push too hard. But you do get all sorts of metals. Gold and silver are byproducts of this. In other words, you could be using this to manufacture metals without mining, basically. The impacts of this are pretty big, and who would have thought it all related back to crop circles, the coherent shapes of crop circles, but it does. So you get these different elements, and that's just another interesting aspect of LENR. People have, you might have heard of Andrea Rossi and the ECAT. That's how I got interested in this area, a kind of very low-cost, safe energy generation system using cold fusion. I forget what Rossi calls this, the ECAT, the energy catalyzer. And he says, by the way, they're going to have a device for sale by December, a very small light. It's powered this way. But one of the challenges of LENR, and I put up a YouTube video about this recently, is that it destroys the equipment it's around. In the same way that our cameras and batteries can get knocked out around crop circles, those little EVOs don't want to stay contained in a reactor. They start transmuting the reacting elements and destroying it, like those little tracks, the strange tracks that I showed you. So maybe they're better at transmuting radioactive materials than as an energy. Here's an example where you see carbon coming out of a pure lead ball. Now, try to explain that through any conventional science. Pure lead ball, and you see a plume of carbon coming out the top, like a volcano or something, from a LENR reactor, because it's transmutation. You're turning lead into carbon. I mean, so alchemy turns out to be real after all. You see where the red arrow is? There is a carbon film coming out of indium. So, this has been seen over and over again. Transmutation of elements. So the reason, you tell this to people, scientists, and they say, wait a minute, electrons repel each other. Didn't you learn that in your physics classes in high school or something? Yeah. Electrons repel, like charges repel, different charges attract. At a large distance, electrons repel each other. When you pack them together, and this is all you're doing in cold fusion in the palladium lattice, is you're packing a lot of hydrogen in. Any way you want to do it. At the close levels or any type of impact, they attract each other into a coherent ball. It's just a natural function of how nature works. We weren't taught this, and just because it wasn't taught in high school doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And again, this is going back to the whole sociocultural stigma. So many people believe if I didn't learn about it in a textbook, it's not real. Wrong. So many phenomena you and I are interested in, they didn't tell us about in high school. I didn't even know I never heard the word crop circles till I graduated from graduate school in the 90s. I didn't even know what it was by 96 until I did an RV session. That was my first contact with a crop circle, was an RV. So we don't hear about these things. That doesn't mean that we can't reinterpret how science works. And it turns out when electrons get close together, they don't repel. They turn into a ball, a cluster charge. Apparently the Egyptians knew about this. They were able to create microball lightning with cat's hair and beeswax, which is basically all you need to, the beeswax being kind of an insulator and the hair creating static charges. So here's really what's going on is everyone accepts the Bose-Einstein condensate, a ball of matter at very cold temperatures. This was discovered in the 90s. Some people won a Nobel Prize for it. Coincidentally in Boulder at the NIST facility, one of the government labs. That's at very cold temperatures. You create a single big atom, right? You've heard about this. It has a wave-like motion of one atom, even though you started with a lot of separate atoms. Everyone already accepts this. What all these folks with Fleischmann and Pons and Ken Shoulders and going really all the way back to Tesla, Nicola Tesla, is you can do it at room temperature with micro ball lightning. If you have the conditions where you have charges coming out and the charges cluster, you get ball lightning. A lot of the time you won't see it. It's too small. It doesn't persist. This is what I think is happening around crop circles. Okay, I think you're getting from the coherency of the shape of the circle, you're getting some coherent matter too. And it could be that these relic neutrinos, like I suggested back in 2013, that somehow the spiraling pattern, because not all the crop circles do this, and we can talk about this in a minute, but it seems that the helical ones, the spiraling ones, they could be redirecting the neutrino, the dark matter. I know this sounds kind of a little far-fetched, but if you've got a better idea, I'm happy to hear it. It's kind of sort of creating this charge bunching in some way. It's ending up in our cameras. We know that when micro ball lightning hits any sort of electronics, just like happened to Tesla and Hutchison and others. The most famous case, or the Joseph Papp engine, Papp was demonstrating this at Caltech in the 60s, and Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, came up to the stage and pulled out the wire from the plug because he thought it was a hoax because it was plugged into the wall for grounding. It was only connected to the ground. And Feynman unplugged it. Papp said, please put that back in. Feynman said, I don't want to. And it blew up. The device blew up because the charge clusters, it just got overloaded. And someone was killed. And Feynman, you probably don't know this, was put on trial for manslaughter. There was injury and a death because he pulled the plug out of the wall. So this is really serious stuff. You don't want to joke with it too much, but it can affect electronics. And even at a very light scale in crop circles, I think there's enough charge clustering going on from these primordial neutrinos that it's creating their own little charge clusters from the pattern, and it's finding their way into our electronics and zapping it. That's my interpretation. And you don't have to agree with that, but that's just how I'm looking at it so far. Hessdalen lights, you've heard about this? Same thing. Ball lightning. I don't want to disappoint you if you thought these were UFOs, from another planet. But the reason we know they're ball lightning is some of the photos really show the spiraling effect, which is exactly what you would think could happen when it goes through a tree or something. Is it's directional, and it changes direction a little bit. There's a lot of silicon and elements in the soil there, and this could be one explanation for what the Hessdalen lights are. It could also be an explanation of all these weird effects around UFOs. I've spent a lot of time studying this. I wrote, obviously, Black Swan Ghosts, and there's camera and battery failure, car stalling around UFOs. You've all heard about this. We've had hundreds of years of this in the U.S. People's cars stalling when the device, and in your countries too, not here. I've talked to people in the UK where it's things hovering over your car. It's pulling energy out of the system. Once you get that coherency, there's a variety of ways it can affect your electronics, camera and bat. And the smell of sulfur. We also have this around UFOs, right? They go out where the craft had landed, smell of sulfur. That's evidence of transmutation. Could be. And the feeling sometimes, if you've talked to some witnesses, they felt it got very cold right around the time of the UFO sighting. Going back to the Bearden things and the Scalar processes where it pulls energy out, could be the same thing. I don't know. But books have been written about this. This is from a book from the 60s, a great book by NICAP, one of our UFO organizations, citizen UFO organization. And just the smell of sulfur and the batteries going out. Psychokinesis, projecting coherent matter. It's part of biology. This is the take-home message from all of this. It's just part of nature. And some people can really harness it. I've seen demonstrations of psychokinesis in Japan when I was there teaching RV 2005 and after. And I saw people do this right in front of my eyes, bend Coke bottles and liquefy them, run them over my arm. I could feel the electricity going into my arm. It's probably... So let me just clear it up. When it comes from the background radiation of the galaxy, that's called a primordial or relic neutrino. When it's produced by us right now, not from the Big Bang, it's called a cold neutrino. Cold meaning because it's slower than the fast ones. But it still has energy. And so I think this is cold neutrinos at work. And curiously enough, I went to a Bigfoot conference in Bailey, Colorado just a couple months ago, and people talked about the same sort of phenomena. Smell of sulfur. Balls of light are seen around Bigfoot. This is a photo of what someone thought they saw in Drake, Colorado. They heard strange sounds. They went behind a cabin, and then they felt very knocked out for about a day and a half. Their camera died. You may have not heard this, and I don't know what you call Bigfoot in Europe. I'm sure you have something like Bigfoot where you are too. Keep in mind the U.S. is a pretty huge country, so there's a lot of space for things like this to happen. But people report their cameras batteries failing around Bigfoot, car batteries. I've talked to people who said it's happened to them. The eyes can glow. I think it's the same sort of process here. I think there's a type, what I think Bigfoot could be, a type of creature, a human maybe, from a long time ago that learned how to harness this coherent matter. I mean, use it in some way, because there are reports of Bigfoot levitating, becoming invisible, credible reports. Over and over, you can read the books from the witnesses. They're very good reports of levitating. It seems to be the same sort of thing, giving off static electricity. If it was just a biological entity, just like us, it probably wouldn't do that, but it could be something that's been around longer than humans that knows how to harness this type of energy. So these witnesses described seeing Bigfoot come out of balls of light. Again, Igor Bortsev from Russia, cloaking, teleportation, he described it, as a paranormal human. I think it's the same sort of phenomena. And again, going back to what's happening now with UFOs, we're hearing about this from people. This is Chris Mellon, he used to work for the Department of Defense, who retired to come forward to talk about this. When you look at some of the slides they presented to Congress, they talk about some of the same sorts of phenomena that we're talking about here: anomalies in space-time, alterations of organisms, instantaneous sensor disassembly, things like this. They talk about experiments. So what I think's going on here is that this has been researched. Somehow it didn't make it out to the public. I don't know exactly why. People have been talking about it, Tesla and others, for whatever reason. I mean, you could be a conspiracy theorist. I don't know, guys. But and here, just to sum it up, this is about the end here. Even at this is Bob Greenyer showing just last week. He started talking about crop circles because the patterns they found in the where the EVOs, the exotic vacuum objects, at a microscopic scale. This is on the right. This is electron microscope. He said it looks like crop circle patterns, and he brought up this Oliver's Castle formation, which I wrote about in Opening Minds, because someone actually saw this in their mind's eye. One of Ron's tour guests, the day before, they drew this out when Ron asked them to draw what they thought might show up tomorrow. And Bob thought it was amazing that here, this is this pattern in 97, exactly what you see in these LENR experiments. So, to sum it up, thanks for listening. Does the helicity, the spin, the vortex structure of many crop circles, this is the Hackpen formation of 99. Really a good one, right? Beautiful one. This is Colin Andrews' photo, by the way. Does that helicity create a vortex action that interacts with charge clusters in some way? That would be my explanation for what's going on with cameras and batteries. I could be wrong, but this is what I think is the most likely explanation based on everything I've heard. And the cool thing about it is it relates crop circles back to dark matter, right? Because this dark matter energy is coming in all the time. I forgot to mention, you have about 10 million dark matter particles, relic neutrinos, in your body every second. I read this in a regular science article a couple days ago. You have 10 million primordial neutrinos passing through your body every second. That's a lot. They all have a charge. If they cluster together, they can do a lot more than when they're just moving through you, right? The chi energy. But isn't it cool that somehow a subject that we've all loved, the crop circles, connects back to dark matter? This is, by the way, another illustration of dark matter distribution in the universe. Instead of the galaxies seeming separate, we can see their threads that connect them. All the galaxies are connected by these long threads of dark matter. Isn't that cool? Okay, so thank you very much, folks. Let me stop sharing my screen. I'll just keep this on for a second. And that's not too much material, but that's what I think's going on, guys.
Mind-blowing.
Well, we have
some questions. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
the details that you just showed in your last slide, it will be in the video tomorrow, and I think I will add them to the email that I will send with the link to that video, right? So that everybody has it. Yeah. All right. So, so this is the time. time that we do the question and answer part. Shall we kick off?
I don't know. I don't know if there's somebody who has from the
Someone from the
participants.
audience? Yeah. So this is how it works. You just start talking, and then the one that talks the loudest has the floor. Yeah. And we do the ones in the chat room. We'll do them afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we have loads of questions.
Yeah, we have some questions.
Yeah. Oh man.
And some stories, I think.
And some stories.
Yeah,
Small stories and questions.
As long as nobody starts talking.
You
Well, so while you were doing the lecture, we wrote down several experiences of ourselves. One of them is, of course, that we experienced camera malfunctions too over the course of the years. Not that many. I think it was only 3 or 4 times max.
in the beginning.
Yeah, but I only remember one incident really vividly. That was that I had taken a digital camera to Hackman Hill.
Mm-hmm.
Before it was a formation that was in the field below the horse.
Okay.
And the battery was completely full when we entered the field. I had changed them that morning, and then when we went in, I couldn't take pictures. There was no battery power at all, and then we went out, and then it was back again. So it seems that these phenomena are not always the same. So sometimes the battery just melts, sometimes it depletes, and then it doesn't come back. And in this case, it came back.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
I've had that happen too. In the Devil's Den formation, someone said they went in '99. I talked to someone from Aspen, Colorado. She had gone there on her own, and she said the same thing happened to her camera. She put the camera away for 4 months, and then it worked again 4 months later.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's what can happen. Yeah. So I do remember that there was some other cases, but they're not as vivid as this one.
No.
What was the next thing you want to say?
You can tell about us making a crop circle.
Well, yeah. Well, this is the story.
Like you said, like you did.
Yeah, when we first started investigating crop circles, we joined the Dutch Center for Crop Circle Studies, and the first act that we did as a group was creating in the north of the Netherlands, at a farm of the chairman. The chairman's parents had a farm, so there was a wheat field there, and we made a crop circle, and it proved pretty damn hard to make a nice. The only thing that was really nice about it, there was one little round grape shop that one of the guys did. The rest didn't make any sense. For anyone that says just get out your stumper board, it's not that easy.
Where was that, Roland?
It was in Groningen, the north of the Netherlands.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
All up in the north.
Very close to the sea.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah.